Welcome to Season 4 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. Today, in episode number 1, we'll be talking with Rehab Eldalil about relinquishing ownership. Rehab Eldalil is an award-winning documentary photographer, visual storyteller, and educator. Her work focuses on the theme of identity, explored through participatory creative practices. She received her BA in photography from Helwan University in Cairo in 2011, her MA in photography from Falmouth University in 2020, and a 1-year certificate in documentary photography from the International Center of Photography in New York in 2021. Her long-term personal project, The Longing of the Stranger Whose Path Has Been Broken, has won numerous awards. She has further received the AFAC and Magnum Foundation's Arab Documentary Photography Program grant, the Photo Evidence W Award, and the World Press Photo Regional Award, among many others. Most recently, she received the Women Photograph and Getty Images Inclusion Grant to work on her new project, Nesting Birds. Rehab's work has been exhibited in many exhibitions around the world, including in the USA, the UK, the UAE, Germany, Brazil, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. Could we start with you just telling us a little bit about the kind of work that you do?
So my work primarily focuses on the broad idea of identity. And I usually get motivation from my own journey seeking what is my identity and the whole complex idea of an identity. But on top of that, I also work to collaborate with the people that I document, I photo shoot, and I try to sort of transform the dynamic from being a photographer and a subject to being a photographer and a protagonist, and try to collaborate with them and include them in the creative process. So my work focuses on participatory practices and challenging the limitation of photography to include other mediums that primarily comes from the collaboration that I have with the protagonists in the stories that I do.
That's really interesting, that shift in the framing from a subject to protagonist. Yeah. Why have you chosen that word in particular? What is it about sort of that shift why did you make that shift even?
Well, it started when I was working on my long-term project, The Longing of the Stranger Whose Path Has Been Broken. I've been working on it for 10 years. So that project is not just personal because of the topic, but it's also personal because it's sort of witnessed the progression that I had developing my own visual language and my own, ethical approaches. And so during that time, I was working with the Bedouin community who I have connections with. My ancestors are Bedou. I don't like to call myself Bedou because I was not brought up as Bedou, but I'm a diaspora. And so I was working with people who are very close to me on a personal level, friends, people whom I consider as family. And so calling them subjects felt wrong, It was easier, let's say, 12 years ago when I was still in college practicing photography and shooting someone from the staff of the university, asking them for a portrait, that I could call them subjects or sitters. But it was a lot harder to call someone that I know very personally a subject. So from that, I started, to try to think of, is it okay to treat this person as a subject or to work with them as a subject? Because it creates this very, very unfair dynamic between me and them. And then once I take out the camera, we're back as friends, back as equals. So it just didn't feel right, honestly. And that came right when I was doing my master's. And I wanted to do my MA in photography about something that is really close to me. And I started to research the idea of representation expectation of autonomy. And from there, I realized that in the project, the story is not about me because I don't consider myself as Beru. It's more about me trying to reconnect to my ancestors through the stories of the people. So it only made sense that they become protagonists of their stories. And from their stories and from their voices, I learn more about myself. And that's what I was also hoping to create when I, bring the work to the world, that people would do the same, that would find inspiration from the indigenous experience of the people, of the protagonists in the stories that they're seeing.
I think that that's really interesting what you said about how like your relationship with your friends and your family changed so much when the camera was present in the interaction, and then it sort of went back to normal when you put the camera away. To what extent did you find that like regarding them as protagonists and having a more participatory process, to what extent did that sort of reduce that power dynamic? And to what extent did it not? Is it possible to ever really break down that power dynamic when one person's holding a camera?
Well, I think it's definitely possible, but of course to a limit. I mean, there is a lot of liberation in letting go of your power position as someone with a camera, and giving space for people to express themselves, and to have a say of how they would like to be photographed, or even to change your photographs afterward, because that's what I did in my project. I would, especially for the female Bedouin members of the community who participated in the work, I would print my photograph on fabric and then ask them to embroider whatever they want to do with the image. So whatever vision I had of the final outcome, it never meets that. It actually, all the time, it actually reaches something that I never expected, and it was a lot better, honestly. So there is definitely liberation, but there's also the limit that you are still doing something, doing a body of work that you have responsibility towards. And so I totally believe that it is possible to let go of the power dynamic when you have that camera, but you still need to keep the responsibility, I think, because you're the one who have done research. You're the one who knows where the work is gonna live, and you're the one who knows that some images might go out of context. So you need to create more articulation to it, whether through simply by captions or by further images, or by working more on the body of work, or creating something to make sure that whatever work that you have done participatory with the people is not exploited afterwards. So yeah, I think the responsibility is important. It must stays there, and you become sort of like a curator of the work as well. Because as I mentioned with the embroidery that I did with the women, I would ask them to do whatever they want. They had full freedom to show or hide themselves in the images. And a lot of the women would agree that they would hide their identity because they are worried about how their images are going to be seen by outside communities. But then I get that surprise when they give me back the fabric, and the embroidery on it actually celebrates the women, whether by highlighting their faces or by creating, decorations around them. So it's more of celebration of their identity. But I still need to curate that in order to make sure that it's still not being used in a way that they wouldn't like. So you still need to be sort of the director or the curator of the process, I think.
So you mentioned that it can be liberating. I think that's a really great word, to relinquish control over the creative process. I don't know, it reminds me of something that I often say about ethics, that, ethics, I think a lot of times people think of it as being limiting, but actually ethics can inspire a lot of creativity in our work. Like you did, as you try to figure out, well, how do I make this in such a way that people have more control, that they can disguise their face or protect their identities if they choose to. That's such a creative approach to using embroidery. That sounds really interesting. And the work is beautiful. I've obviously seen it on your website. And how are questions of maybe ownership and authorship complicated when you are doing something so participatory where people do have such a hand in making the work?
Well, this can be divided into two things: the process itself, the production of the work, and then the publication of the work somehow. So in the production of the work, letting go of the ownership to me was mainly to make sure that I don't have any influence on the community's choice of how they would like to be photographed. So a lot of the times I would just ask them like how you would like to be photographed, how do you want to stand, the lighting, whatever. And then I add in my own, visual language into the work and shoot. Or I would take the photograph and, print it on fabric and then ask them to do whatever. And I would give them a variety of threads and beads and everything just to make sure, and if they want anything extra, to make sure that they have everything that they could choose from in order to create the work. And I never tried to influence the actual production of the work, but it was really important for me to make sure that we are on agreement of what is this work for. So we had a lot of conversations on, what is the project. It's about the Bedouin experience, the Bedouin identity. It's about the indigenous experience. It's about the whole idea of belonging. And based on that, we do the work in order to make sure that it is aligned. So whatever I get, I don't do any changes to it. And if I do any changes, like for example, if I get a poetry piece written by a community member and I put it as a diptych with one of my photographs, I go back and ask them like, are you okay with this? Is this fine? And so on. So I agree, that is completely liberating, because that takes off the pressure that I have on myself to make sure that I'm doing something that the community would be happy with, because they are part of the process. So it felt that I could ask freely to experiment, and I know that they will either be okay with it or not, and they would tell me. I could raise a lot of questions to make sure that we are aligned on the topic. And I could accept any artwork in return to be part of the process without feeling that, that doesn't match what I want to do, because it's all about participation. And whatever addition that the community would add into the work, I know it would add something. So it just felt that I'm finally open to different mediums. I'm not limiting myself to photography. I'm not limiting the project to just my voice. So that is definitely extremely liberating, and the whole idea of sharing ownership of the production of the work was beautiful, and I really enjoyed it. The second part, though, it's the whole idea of publishing the work. And even though I still consider as the work as a shared project, I don't just own the work. And in the book where I published the project, I've written down the names of everyone who was part of the project within the community. I consider this as a community project. I still have this responsibility to make sure that whatever way it is published, it is not manipulated. So although I share the ownership, I do not share that responsibility. I need to make sure that it is on to me. So how is it going to be published on social media? There are some images that specifically some of the women who participated in the work asked not to be shared on social media, so I needed to respect that. How it would be published as an article or a photo story in a magazine online, or as a print. And then finally the book. The book it was a lot easier because it was easy to share with them the edit once we had it ready, and I would get the approval. Yes, it looks good, and so on. But a lot of the articles, it was harder to include them in that process. So I couldn't share that responsibility with the community, unfortunately. But I think because I am the one who started the project, because I'm the photographer behind it, it was only right for me to also hold this responsibility to make sure that I'm still doing justice to the community once the work is out there.
I think that's an important distinction that you've made between, you're sharing the ownership, but you're not sharing the responsibility, that the responsibility ultimately, in part, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's because you're the one who has the platform, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a really useful distinction. I wanted to ask you a little bit as well. You were talking about how, over this project, over the past 10 years, you've developed your own visual language and you've also developed your own ethical approaches. How did you do that? Because that's something, that we really push for in the Photography Ethics Center, is for all photographers to write their own statement of ethics, their own approach to their practice through ethical principles. So I wonder if you could maybe share a little bit about your own story, or how you did that, or things that you learned along the way.
Sure. So I was very privileged to have had the chance to be mentored by a lot of great photographers throughout the years. So I started my MA in 2018, and I consider that year to be sort of like the leaping, like the tipping point for the project, because during the MA, I needed to be very critical of my work. And I had great mentors during then at Falmouth University, where they challenged everything that I thought of. It wasn't like, because I'm Egyptian, because I have Bedouin ancestors, I have this right, to do this project. No, I needed to really be very critical of myself. And then I met Tanya Habjuka outside of the university. So Tanya Habjuka is an amazing photographer, a Jordanian Texan photographer currently based in Palestine. And she just bursted a lot of the bubbles that I had, because I came to her with this doubt if I have this right to narrate the story, if I'm doing it actually in a way that, because I felt that there was something wrong with me just taking the photographs myself. It just felt weird, because going back to the first thing that we discussed, it just felt that once I have that camera, once I'm taking these images from my own perspective, I'm taking away the power of the people who are very close to me, and I'm only using my voice to tell the story. And it just didn't make any sense, because I'm trying to learn from the community and the people that I'm shooting. So how is that even possible? It just felt very weird. And so she was very inspiring, because she works on something that is called collaborative portraits, where she asks the people that she photo shoots, that they would choose how they would like to be photographed, and they would create these very creative ways to hide their faces. Specifically, when she was working on a project with Syrian refugees in Jordan, constantly working with women in Palestine. And so that was extremely inspirational. And so I started to research more about how I could create something that works for me as a photographer, and how I would like to express myself visually, and also how would that work with the community and the mediums that the community naturally use in their daily life. So that answer, of course, was embroidery, which is a very traditional Bedouin medium, and poetry for the men who constantly use it to express themselves. And then I got mentored more and more by Eric Gottesman, Fred Ritchen, all of these amazing people who have taken their way and expressed their way of ethical standards in photography and visual storytelling. So that was one. And two, looking back at archives of the community that I'm working with, and realizing the huge gap there is between these archives and how the community are and who made these archives, and realizing that 99% of the archives about the Bedouin people in Sinai and in Palestine were taken by Western men, and it were completely different from reality. So how can we change that? The answer is not just me being part of the community somehow. It's more of having the community be part of the project, because that's why I have this long title for the project, The Longing of the Stranger, because I still consider myself as a stranger. And I remind myself I'm always going to be a stranger, because no matter how much I am involved into the community, I mean, after 15 years being part of the community, I'm still a stranger somehow, because I was not brought up as a Bedouin. So I needed to respect that. So the answer for me was inviting the community to be part of the project itself. That took a lot of research, a lot of trial and error, experimentations with the community. You should see the backup. There's like so many different ways we try to make this project happen. But at the end, the involvement of the community was, of course, the answer.
Yeah, I think that seems like a really great recommendation as well that you have in there, because your project doesn't actually use archival images, correct? But to still look at the archive, I mean, that's a really, I think, important and a really useful maybe suggestion for people as well, is to look at how a community has been represented historically, I guess, to help ensure that you're not also replicating a lot of those sort of
Exactly.
stereotypes and the visual language that has been inherited really from colonialism.
Exactly, exactly. And as photographers, we a lot of the times subconsciously fall into this because we are influenced by other visuals. So, the magazines that we have seen from, from the 50s or the 60s, and we aspire to be photographers like such and such, but we don't realize that this actually influences our language. So even if we are insiders within the communities that we're shooting, we're still getting inspiration from the outside perspectives, and not just outside perspectives, because outside perspectives could actually be extremely respectful at times, but colonial perspectives, basically.
Totally, totally. And especially I feel like when we've come to see so many of these photographs, so we sort of internalize them as the way of visually documenting a certain community, but also as what is a good photograph, you know?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's such an important point. In the making of the project, have you encountered any sort of specific ethical dilemmas that you could share with us?
Yes, a lot. But the first thing that comes to mind is so when I started to ask the community members how they would like to be photographed, a lot of the men, they would like, I would like to get a photograph taken and put it on WhatsApp, so my fiance could see it, and just a way to flirt and stuff, and that was fun on a personal level, but it just didn't feel that these images would be used later in the project. But it was just fun to break the ice and see how they would like to be photographed. But at some point in the beginning, a lot of the contributors to the work, they would ask me to photograph them while they're holding their phone, or while they're wearing sneakers, and it was very explicit and just felt very fake. And for them, it was like, I want to make sure that people from the outside communities know that we're not closed off, we're not uncivilized, we're not whatever, whatever. And it created this sort of, I don't know, just felt as if it's an opposite to whatever, archival images were taken before of the community, but it's still putting the community in a way that does not respect them. And that was an ethical dilemma for me. Should I respect their requests and take these photographs? But that would still put them in this sort of like cartoonized, in a disrespected way. So how can I balance my knowledge as a photographer with me being part of this project? And so I had a lot of discussions with them. I took the photographs. I actually submitted at one of the terms in at the university these images, because I only had these images, but it just didn't feel okay. But the answer was to keep on shooting. So after we did these images, after they felt okay, our voices were heard, they started to loosen up a little bit more and stop thinking about how they want to break the stereotypes. By creating more stereotypes, they started to think about it on how to break the stereotypes. We actually do our day-to-day thing, and let this prove that these tropes that were made about them are not correct. So that's when, I don't like the word genuine, but more genuine images came up, and less stereotypical, basically. So it was definitely a dilemma for me to try to make sure that I'm not leading the community in another, colonial trap somehow. So that's one. There's a lot of others.
In relation to that idea, I think there is something really complicated about that, isn't there? About unpacking the community members wanting to be represented as being influenced, I guess, by Western culture. because it's still sort of defining themselves in relation to Europe, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, who calls a community modern? And what is the standard for a community to be modern, you know? We need to think about that. So for the Bedouin community, when they think, oh, we want to make sure that, or for any community, like even like people in Cairo, like in urban cities, we want to prove that we're modern and we're civilized and whatever, and the standards are Western countries, in the European countries or whatever. But the power here is when we realize that we can break these standards. Being modern does not mean we should be molded in that specific way. The Bedouin community, who are extremely modern in many ways, being having access to the internet, having these extremely low crime rates, very beautiful villages, a very organized system, the women having leading most of the families and actually are the main breadwinners of a lot of the families within the Bedouin communities. That is modern. That is very modern. The whole idea is they're an indigenous community. They are a community that know where they come from. They're protecting their land, and they, in one way or another, they're still preserving their culture and heritage, which is more modern than a lot of urban areas that have forgotten their identities. And that's where we have this identity crisis all around the world, not knowing where we come from, and hence the book that I have made. you know so we could learn a lot about this community. They're contemporary, they're modern, and they're indigenous, and that's beautiful, and that should be celebrated in so many ways, and to break what modern means from the past, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that there is so much responsibility then is that in that, as well as an image maker and somebody with, we all read visual language every day, but you've developed those skills of analyzing and critiquing visual language and using visual language in a way that most people don't really spend the time to do. And so I guess it does add a layer of complication when, the people that you're working with are wanting to use visual language in a certain way, but there may be pitfalls of that they might not be aware of. And so, yeah, I can understand that would be a very complicated situation. But I also think that your how you worked through that and just like sticking with it and continuing the project and continuing to, I guess, deepen those relationships is also a really great sort of takeaway for people.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it was helpful for me, so I would definitely advise it. And that takes us back to the whole idea of responsibility, because even if you're sharing the process with the community or with the people that you're shooting, you still have this responsibility of, of how the work would be seen, how the work would live, and how the work would be molded at the end. And you have this responsibility to analyze the work and criticize it in a way that maybe the people inside it, the protagonists of the stories, maybe don't really see it for many reasons. One of which because they are inside the story. So usually when you're inside the story, you don't really see a lot of the pitfalls. So that's totally normal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess also thinking about how people in other contexts will read those images, because, yeah, people in other countries and from other backgrounds are going to read those images very differently than other Bedouin people.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so you've worked on other personal projects as well, though. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. So in 2021, I worked on a project called Traces of What Remains. It's a lot shorter term if you compare it to The Longing, because I only worked on it for around 5 months. But that project commemorates 10 years after the Egyptian Revolution in January 25th, 2011. So what I did is that I took portraits of former political activists still living in Egypt, and I added a diptych of the very few remaining objects they have still as a memorabilia from the revolution. So that project was very, very emotional for me, because I had to to process a lot of the traumatic experiences I've had. I personally was an activist during the revolution. I went into protests. I almost got arrested numerous of times, almost got shot. And I also documented the revolution in 2011, 2012, and then I stopped. And I actually, okay, I'm gonna drift a little bit because I actually stopped for my first ethical dilemma as a photographer. Okay. So in 2012, there were very violent attacks on protesters in a specific area in downtown Cairo. And they primarily, police officers were primarily targeting eyes. And they have actually blinded a lot of protesters and activists. And so a lot of photographers would be not in the front lines. They were a little bit in the back, and they would shoot whatever people come back from the front lines. They would take the shot. So I remember I was standing there, and one person, he got violently shot in the leg. He was lying on the ground, bleeding and screaming for help. And there were around like 5 photographers, mostly non-Egyptians, standing around him taking photographs instead of helping. And at that time, I was like, I stood there. I froze honestly for like 5 minutes. I couldn't believe what is happening, and I've let go of my camera, and I went in to help him. And that was the last image I took in the revolution. And I felt that there must be something. I mean, I cannot be wearing just my photography hat and not wearing, my human hat. There has to be some sort of balance. And it started to feel like photographers will, vulture over any interesting image that they can take in a safe zone. It just felt weird and wrong. I mean, that started the ripple effect of a lot of ethical questions about me being a photographer. But going back to the project, the Traces project in 2021, I wanted to give tribute to the Egyptian revolution, but also commentate on the oppressive regime that we're still living in. And so it was hard for me to process everything that has happened throughout these 10 years, but also to ask former activists, mostly my friends, to be part of the project, because I would ask them to remember things that might create more pain or re-traumatize them. So that was very difficult. And so I chose deliberately to only work with people who I have previous connections with, mostly close friends or coworkers. And I would give them time to process whatever they're saying, to make sure that they're okay, they're not gonna fall into any sort of panic attacks or be re-traumatized in any way. So that was very difficult. And also the other difficult part is that I want to celebrate them, but I also want to protect their identity, because with the regime that we're currently living in, I cannot easily put clear images of activists on social media and expect that they will not be taken to prison the next day. That would be very naive of me. So I had to find creative ways to take actual portraits of them, but without showing their faces. And next to them, in another image as a diptych, the very, very remaining memorabilia that they had. And a lot of them would take time to find it, because a lot of them have hidden it, one, to make sure that it wouldn't be used against them if they are arrested, and two, because it holds a lot of emotional baggage. So I needed to make sure. I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not a therapist. So I need to make sure that I'm not causing any, psychological harm to the protagonists in the stories. So I needed to be a lot calmer as a photographer, and just, give them space to say whatever they want to say without pushing them to say more. And I also wanted to make sure that my own vulnerability as well is being shown, because we are sharing this experience together. They're not just the ones unloading, I'm unloading as well. Even though I would take like 5 minutes to take the shot, maybe there are like 2 or 3 hours before, just to make sure that we're paving the way to a healthy process of them telling their story. So that was the project. It got shortlisted for the World Press Photo during then. and it got published, but outside of Egypt. That's again the responsibility. I wanted to make sure that it doesn't get published in Egypt because, just to avoid, any issues. If actually there are any publications who would have agreed to publish it in Egypt, I still wouldn't have done it, just to make sure. I'd changed their names, but just to be careful that, there wouldn't be any consequences or implications, negative implications on them.
Yeah, absolutely. And how did you take care of yourself in that project? Because you mentioned that it was very emotional and very difficult for you as well. And I think that that's something that we sometimes forget, that we have to take care of ourselves too.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I most of my work, whether it is personal work or commissioned, a lot of it has to do with human interest stories. A lot of it have to do with vulnerable communities, and so I find myself in many times extremely emotional and being very affected. Writing really helps. I write a lot. I write about my thoughts. I write a lot about, whatever emotions that I have during that time. I write either before and sometimes both, but I write before I talk to the person, just to sort of give myself a pep talk, and I write a lot after as well. After I do a shoot or I do an interview. So writing really helps. And also speaking to other people. So having this peer support. So my husband is someone who I unload to a lot. I also have a couple of friends who are from the same industry, who would understand where I'm coming from. That we just talk and get these emotions out there. In one project that I worked on domestic violence, I needed to go to a therapist afterwards because it was really impacting me a lot. So just giving yourself this personal check-in during the work, or I prefer during if it's a long-term story, but also after, just to make sure that you're getting out of it in a healthy way, is I think is very important for a lot of us as photographers or photojournalists.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's brilliant advice. So I understand as well that your long-term project, Longing, has been published as a book, as you mentioned, and that just launched earlier this year. Could you tell us a little bit about that launch and what that was like?
Sure. So the book was launched this year in Cairo. The book itself is a fruit of a number of awards. So the Photo Evidence W Award, which have published the book, also the Trobadis Mediterranean Albert Camus Award, and the project itself, it won the World Press Photo. So there's like a lot of buzz around it. But what was important for me to make sure is that the book would launch in Cairo. So that's what happened in February. And what was more important for me, that community members, the Bedouin community members, would be part of the launch. So I invited them, of course, because of distance. Only one came in, but Musa Jabali, he's one of the community members, and he's one of the people who were extremely involved in the project for so many years. He came into the launch. After I gave a quick presentation about the project, he joined me on stage, and he also started to share his experience about the project, about the book. It was his first time to see the book, actually, because he wanted it to be as a surprise, even though he's the one who wrote the afterword in the book, but he wanted it to be a surprise. So I gave him the book like an hour before we started. And so this makes me extremely emotional because when one of the audience members asked him what he thought about the book, he said that always wanted to do something to celebrate his community and his identity, but he couldn't articulate it. But I helped him do that. And that for me was the biggest validation ever. That for me was very, very important. Any awards or anything after just doesn't matter, because that is the whole target of the project, is to make sure that you're honoring the community that you're working with. And for me, I've been trying to honor the Bedouin community because I'm unable to find my Bedouin ancestors. So the best way for me to do it, the closest way for me to do it, is to actually celebrate the community that are actually here. So that mattered to me a lot. And what's great is that because you mentioned platform earlier, what's great inviting the community members to also be part of the process after finishing the project is that you share the platform. There were a lot of questions during the launch that didn't have to do with the book. It had to do with the community. And so who is better to answer this other than a community member, other than Musa? So Musa answered a lot of these questions, a lot of questions that has to do with the Bedouin identity, that has to do with their current struggles. That for me was honoring the process. It wasn't just a process to create work and get it out there. It's actually honoring the process of them sharing this ownership even after the project is exhibited. So that for me is a huge highlight because I'm still learning about collaboration. I'm still learning about my own ethical code or whatever. And it was a huge highlight for me to share the launch with Musa.
Absolutely. No, that sounds very impactful for sure. And I guess relatedly or on that note, could you tell us what photography ethics means to you?
Okay, so this reminds me of a class that I had during ICP with Fredrickson, and it was all about ethics, right? And so I started writing a list of questions that I would personally go through before starting a project, and that would create for me the ethical code that I would use during that specific project. Because I believe that first, your ethics depends on you as a person, as a human, as a photographer, but also on the project and the people that you're working with. Working with people that you have zero connections with earlier is completely different than working with people that you have connections with before. Being an insider is completely different than being an outsider. And I'm totally against the idea of us shooting whatever we're only part of, because how would we learn from one another? But you need to do it in a very conscious way, in a very thoughtful way, in a very respectful way, in a collaborative way, you know? So that's what the whole idea of ethics is very fluid, because it all depends on all of these different variables. But it's something that you need to always think about. Just like when you're thinking about budgeting for your work, about shooting plans, travel itinerary, whatever, you still need to have this ethical column that you need to fill in. And it all depends on these different variables that I just mentioned. But I would start off with some questions, and one of the questions that I still remember from that class was, "Can you live with a clear conscience? Can you go to bed with a clear conscience after you finish this project or not?" And I think that hits hard, because sometimes a photographer would feel pressured by an editor or by a deadline to take a specific image, and they would pressure the people that they're shooting in order to get that image. But then how do they feel afterward? Does it feel great to publish it? Would you be happy to live with that or not? And if there's just this one tiny sorrow feeling that you have, and there's something wrong with the process that led you to take this specific image. So that question was very important. The other question is, how well do you know the people? How would you like to connect to the people? How long would you take before you get your camera out? I personally, with people that I don't have any connections with before, I don't prefer going in with a camera at the beginning. I would prefer to do a couple of visits without the camera, just a human to human connection. And once we have this trust basis in, I would bring in the camera and start shooting. They would know that I'm a photographer and I'm gonna do this eventually if they agree. But just creating this relationship outside of the power dynamic that the camera brings in the conversation, I think is important. As photography ethics in general, I think it raises a lot of arguments and a lot of topics, because it's very fluid and changeable, and there's a lot of variables in it. But that doesn't mean it's not important. It actually means it's so important that you need to consider so many variables for it. So it needs to be on the top of your list when you're working. I think going off with photography ethics to make sure that you're not going to be criticized in a specific way after you finish the project is not the right way to do it. Because sometimes you need to take specific images to advocate for something, and you will get specific criticism about it. But if you're doing it while being very clear about your own ethics, you're gonna take these criticism in a way that would raise you more as a human being and as a photographer, rather than take you down, and you might even have some answers to the person or the people who are criticizing you. So I think it's a very under discussed topic, like in universities. I teach in universities, and ethics is not even in the curriculum, and I need to add it in with some arguments in order to talk about ethics. It's not in a lot of photography workshops. It's not considered in it, and it's discussing it is very lacking in the industry, and I think it's very important to do so, and not just with photographers, but also with the gatekeepers, with editors, with magazines, with people who are actually having power over this platform and this industry. I think it's very important. That's why I'm super happy and very excited and humbled to be invited to this podcast.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. You can also rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Join me next week when we hear from Robin Hammond on balancing impact. In each episode of the podcast, we ask our guests, what does photography ethics mean to you? This is a question that everyone in the photography industry should be able to answer. That's why the Photography Ethics Center is asking you, our listeners, to commit to writing and publishing your own statement of ethics. Visit www.photoethics.org/ethics to learn more and to make the pledge committing to ethical transparency, accountability, and awareness. That's www.photoethics.org/ethics.